Hello and welcome to Witness Aid UK. Today I'm going to recommend some books to you. If you left the Watchtower some years ago and you have not been properly deprogrammed from your Watchtower indoctrination, the chances are that you may go back to the Watchtower. You may think that's a ridiculous suggestion, but in my own case in 1990, when I left the Watchtower for the first time, I went back again a few years later because I didn't have any resources to help me to deprogram my brain and cleanse it of the Watchtower indoctrination, the mental disease which had been put into me since childhood. So it's very helpful if you can not only leave the Watchtower, but have good reasons for doing so, and know in your heart and in your mind that you have made a wise decision, and that way you are unlikely to ever go back. It's one thing to get out of the Watchtower, but it's quite another to get the Watchtower out of you. And that's why these books will be helpful to you. Some of them are available free online. Most of them are available in British public libraries. And if you go online to an online bookstore, you can buy them for just a few pounds second hand. The first book I would recommend, which is really a standard text for former Jehovah's Witnesses, is Crisis of Conscience by Raymond Franz. I'm not going to give you a review of each book in depth because you can find customer reviews online if you look at online bookstores. But basically, Crisis of Conscience was written in the 1980s by Raymond Franz, who had been on the governing body for about 9 years. He was the nephew of Fred Franz, the 4th president of the Watchtower Society. Franz gives a very detailed insight into what goes on in the meetings of the governing body, and he also exposes a number of cover-ups by the Watchtower, quite shocking cover-ups, which caused the murder, rape and persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in the country of Malawi. That's bad enough, but while that was going on, Jehovah's Witnesses in Mexico were doing something which is also unlawful according to Jehovah's Witnesses, but they were doing it with the full approval of the governing body. Ray Franz's second book, In Search of Christian Freedom, is also worth reading. It's a discussion of Bible teachings as compared to Watchtower teachings, and it's very informative if you decide to go on to be a Christian. Another book that's important to read is A Good History of the Watchtower, and that you will find in James Penton's book Apocalypse Delayed. James Penton was a historian at Toronto University, and he gives a very fair account. In my opinion, it's far too generous an account of the Watchtower Society's history, but well worth reading. James Penton wrote another historical book about the Watchtower called Jehovah's Witnesses under the Third Reich, and it gives details of the persecution of German Jehovah's Witnesses during the 1930s and 1940s under Adolf Hitler's regime. Jehovah's Witnesses like to jump on the bandwagon when it comes to the Holocaust and the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany. To read their literature, you would think that millions of Jehovah's Witnesses died. In fact, if you do some research, you will find that only about 200 Jehovah's Witnesses were executed under the Nazis. 200 deaths is bad enough, But it's certainly not the tens of thousands that the Watchtower would like us to believe. Thinking now about 1914, I would recommend Carl Olaf Johnson's book, The Gentile Times Revisited, which gives an in-depth study of the history of Babylon and Jerusalem. As you may know if you're a former witness, the history of these two nations and the fall of Jerusalem is a key date in the reaching of the date 1914. 1914 is when Christ was supposed to have come back invisibly in the heavens, according to the Watchtower Society. But when you look at the information that Johnson gives, it's very clear that the Watchtower, once again, has its facts wrong. In fact, in the late 1960s, Johnson sent the material which makes up that book to the Watchtower Society in Brooklyn, and he invited them to examine his research and to amend their end times doctrines and to put it under their banner as if it came from them. Well, they didn't. He was disfellowshipped. Another very good book, which is worth reading, again by Carl Olaf Johnson, in conjunction with a chap called Herbst, is The Signs of the Last Days. When? And this examines Matthew 24 in particular, where Jesus talks about nation rising against nation, great earthquakes, pestilences, and so on and so on. And Jehovah's Witnesses have been using this chapter of the Bible in particular to compare it with the 20th century, particularly since 1914. And they say that 1914 really marked the beginning of the last days. And it's obvious that this is the case because World War I broke out in 1914 and we've seen nothing but earthquakes, famines, pestilences and great wars in the 20th century. However, if you do some research into history, you will find that the 20th century is not at all unusual in world history as far as earthquakes and famines and war and pestilence are concerned. So again, I recommend that book. Recently, I've been reading the works of Karen Armstrong, and here's one book that I would recommend. Karen Armstrong's book is called The Bible, the Biography, and you'll be surprised what you find out when you read this book. It discusses who wrote the Bible, where it was written, and when. Do you know, for example, why there are 2 creation accounts in the book of Genesis? Or, why are there 2 flood accounts in the book of Genesis? And who actually wrote the first 5 books of the Bible? I'm sorry, if you said Moses, you're wrong. So I recommend that book because it will give you a new perspective on a book which for you was very important at one time and may still be. In general, I would recommend anything that Karen Armstrong writes because she knows more about God and the Bible and religion than the men of Brooklyn in the governing body know together, collectively. She's a very fine writer. At the moment, I'm reading another of her books, which is called A History of God. And this is looking at man's search for God and man's discovery of God and even his creation of God from the perspective of Jews, Christians and Muslims. So again, a very interesting book to read. Another helpful book I read when I left the Watchtower finally is called Twisted Scriptures by Mary Alice Cranalaga. That's how I say her name anyway. And it discusses controlling religions. The Watchtower is a particularly bad controlling religion. But believe me, there are other religions, particularly Christian religions, who control their members by twisting scriptures and using the supposed authority of God to control their members. By the way, all of these books are listed on my blog. You'll find them at witnessaid.blogspot.com. The next book is a philosophy book. It's called The God of Philosophy by Roy Jackson. And it discusses questions such as God's existence, miracles, life after death, prayer, and of course the big question that everyone wants to know the answer to, the problem of evil in the world. So I recommend any introductory book on the subject of the philosophy of religion. Another book I want to recommend is one which I think you have never read. In fact, if you wanted Jehovah's Witnesses, I am fairly convinced that you have not read the Bible. Now, when you stop laughing at that ridiculous statement I've just made, let me say this. In 25 years as an adult witness, I never read the whole Bible. I tried to a few times. My mother, who was a Jehovah's Witness for 45 years, had never read the whole Bible. I challenged her on this one day, and she waffled and said, "Oh, I must have read it. I'm sure I've read it. I read it all the time." Well, yes, I'm sure that you, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, have read the Bible at some time. But have you read from Genesis to Malachi? Have you read from Matthew to Revelation? I'm sorry, but I doubt it. So, why am I recommending that you read the Bible? Well, just so you can say that you've read it, really. Because it's something that was very important in your life for a long time. And you've probably walked away from the Watchtower and you've never really read the book that it was supposed to be about. So I recommend the Bible. You may become a Christian, who knows? You might even become an atheist. But that's up to you. Thanks for watching.